All right, let's see. The past test is Wednesday. And it is a map of the world. And folk, I think it's ridiculously easy, but I was discussing with a fellow part-time faculty member. You're amazed. I'm amazed at how many college students cannot look at a blank world map and cannot tell me where South America is. Some of you are snickering a little bit, but it's not really funny. But if you don't know, hey, look it up. I mean, I've told you what's on it. South America is on the map. 10 points if you get it right. North America is on it. And along with Greece, Italy, the places that we either have visited or will visit. Africa. Hopefully every one of you can look at a blank map and write down Africa where it belongs. Yeah, okay, yeah, hopefully. All right. Now, I'm not going to ask, where Liechtenstein is. Does anybody know?
Where what?
It's between Switzerland and France. Little bitty, one of those old European duchies that never got mixed up with another country. Luxembourg, anybody know where Luxembourg is? It's between Belgium and Germany, I believe.
It's just one city, right?
It's a couple of little towns. Yeah, they actually made the common market headquarters in Luxembourg. I mean, to kind of give it some clout. Yeah, and there's Monaco, little bit in Monaco. You hear about it every once in a while, but it's another one of those little independent countries in southern France that never joined the main nation. Yeah, there's a few of those teeny-weeny countries still left in Europe, but I'm not going to ask for that. But I am going to ask for Rome, Italy, Greece, Arabia. Hey, I think it's really imperative you know where Arabia is.
There was a question.
Yeah.
There was a question last week by a young lady senator.
Yeah.
Did you mean Arabia as an area, or Saudi Arabia, or Yemen?
Okay. Arabia as a geographical area in this case, because that's what's important. The fact Yemen, Yemen, but it's the places that we're going to talk about. Yemen did not exist on the map at the time period we're going to be talking about it. And neither did the United Arab Emirates and those places. I mean, but Arabia is a geographical term, of which Saudi Arabia is the main part still. Okay. All right. Greece. A few of you are turning these things in. All right, papers. If anybody has your paper project, I'll take it now. Then, yeah, you can bring it forward now. Then, I've got a few things I want to say about them. Now, folks. Now they've turned it in. I don't care whether you did like this student did and just rewrote mine and corrected it, or if you rewrote it from scratch. That's not the issue. There were several issues, of course. For one thing, the grammar on what I wrote was deliberately terrible.
Yeah, it was really hard to read.
It was supposed to be hard to read. Usually you write it better. Now, it was hard to read. The grammar was terrible. And also, there was one place where I had 3 sentences in a row beginning with the same prepositional phrase. Some of you caught that. Most of them didn't. Also, I spelled Iliad and Odyssey in one place. Iliad was italicized and Odyssey was not. They both should have been italicized. Some of you nodding your heads, yeah, you know what I'm talking about. Iliad, every time you use Iliad and Odyssey, it should have been italicized. If nothing else, for consistency's sake. What you do with one, do with all. But the main thing I'm looking for, folks, is the stuff I wrote about mythologies, quite frankly, I do not believe. And it was refreshing to, I read a lot of them that this early morning class turned in. One young lady turned in one that said, without mythologies, our world would not be what it is. From those mythologies, we get our law, our political systems. So, hey, that's something I hadn't even thought of. They are important to us, not to mention the days of the week. Something else. I said primitive mentality. To me, a people who could build the Great Pyramid, the long, straight Nazca lines, the Cuzco stones, Baalbek, they were not primitive. They knew about astronomy in some ways beyond what we do. They knew their mathematics. They could carry pi out to the fourth decimal place, something our mathematicians did not do till the 1600s. And when I talked about the Greeks today, they went to some of them are believed to have gone to Egypt and got a lot of stuff from Egypt. Now, I want to say this about Zeus. His head popping open and out popped Venus. None of you picked up on it, but there have been astronomers, ancient historians, who believe that what they were observing was, at one time, the planet Venus, they think, might have been orbiting Jupiter. Just like right now, there are about 30 moons orbiting Saturn and about 25 orbiting Jupiter. Some 4 of them very large. And even with a small pair of binoculars, you can see the 4 Galilean, they're called Galilean moons because Galileo discovered them. But they believe that Venus once orbited Jupiter. And of course, it all looked like one moon. I mean, probably one big star. Venus and Jupiter together would look like one star. Then, all of a sudden, Venus somehow broke away from Jupiter for some reason. And when it did, the ancients said, hey, Venus is being born from Jupiter. They were observing a celestial phenomenon that they explained with their mythologies. Now, this might be pure bunk, but then again, there are persons who claim, I mean, planet Venus is unique in it's some 800 degrees. The temperature is not due to greenhouse effect, folk. It's due somehow to a very recent formation, something catastrophic that happened to it. Venus has been resurfaced several times. Have any of you ever heard this from another source? And also, Venus is the only body in the solar system where the sun comes up in the west and sets in the east. It has a retrograde motion. Unless something hit Venus and nudged it and moved it, that's virtually impossible. All the other bodies in the solar system rotate from east to west. Venus rotates from west to east, backwards. And again, that's difficult to explain. But again, if you'd missed that, I wouldn't count on a point, but I'd sure like for somebody to have picked up on it before now. Now, of course, granted, those of you who turned your paper in late, no, I'm going to knock points off. I'm not going to add points, but I'm going to knock them off. I mean, I say so in the syllabus, so hopefully we understand each other. I do say so. But mythologies do not necessarily show a primitive mentality. If anything, we have a primitive mentality because we believe. Now, the idea that flying snakes do not exist.
Wait, there's a flying snake.
What's that?
There's totally a snake that flies.
Well, yeah, there is a what do you call it, a gliding snake. Yes, there is. Definitely is. That's like there's a flying squirrel.
Yes.
A squirrel that glides. There is a snake that can. Its movement, that's slithers around and goes down. Yes, there is a flying snake, but also there were flying reptiles at one time. Now, one of you caught on to the idea that a negative cannot be proven. I've seen a lot of PhDs do this, make statements that there is no evidence that. Folk, there is evidence for every phenomenon in the universe. The Chinese have a saying that there's never been an idea so absurd what some philosophers uttered it. There's always evidence for anything. What's the evidence for flying reptiles? They're fossils, they're bones. We have a lot of flying reptile bones around. The problem is, all those things existed, died out 65 million years ago. How come they have soft tissue? Like one of us talked about not too long ago. They have soft tissue. How come the pictures and descriptions of them look so much like the fossils we find? I'm talking about the dragons and dinosaurs being dragons. As for Beowulf never existing, one of his sisters married a king, and we know she was a historical figure. So it's not like this was just made up. The place it occurred, Denmark, the time, probably around 600. Some of the people featured in the story are real, genuine historical figures. But I believe Don, so far, you're the only one I've read that said something about you cannot prove a negative, or a negative is not. I mean, you can't argue from absence of evidence. Just because there's no evidence that, hey, you can say there's no evidence for conspiracies, which would be wrong. Communism was, in fact, a worldwide conspiracy. But in order to say that, you'd have to be able to see the whole world, every niche and nook and cranny at one time, because even if you can only see half the world, the conspirators would certainly be conspiring somewhere in the other half.
You would
to
have-
say- that's
you
it.
would- You'd have to know Don Rumsfeld well enough to know that the absence of evidence is not the evidence of absence.
That's what you said. You're the only one so far who I've seen that, the absence of evidence. But I've seen PhDs, right? We have no evidence that there's no, the absence of evidence is not the evidence of absence. All right. Again, I faked most of you out. Well, if you were trying to please me by believing what you thought I believed, what I wrote in there, most of it, 90%, I thoroughly, totally disbelieve. The mythologies do contain something that, I mean, some people believe that the mythologies are a coded language that will be known to the wise when the time comes for us to know them. I mean, be that what it may, I mean, you know, but what do they tell us? I think among other things, they tell us that some things were going on back there that have not been going on for a long time, but that will be going on again at some time, and maybe they're not too distant future. And, well, you can believe what you wish, folk. All right. Any other? Go ahead. Well, you'll have one. All right, about the papers now. Thank you. I cannot promise when I'll grade them, except I'm going to do my utmost best to have them graded by the end of the week. The grades so far, the ones I had received up until this time last week, those grades are on iCollege. Anyone who turned them in since, I don't think anyone in here did, turn them in since Wednesday of last week. But anyone who turned them in since, your grades are not on iCollege yet. But some of you have seen your grade on iCollege. I want you to, once I've gotten them all graded, I'll give them back to you, and you can see your comments. But again, everyone, well, I always have one that's outstanding, and that one this young lady in the other class wrote is the one that so far is outstanding with mine. These myths are what made us. All right, I saw a thing on education where they're trying to throw out the old stories that kids used to read for hundreds of years. Stories about Little Red Riding Hood, stories about Humpty Dumpty sat in the wall. They're saying that these stories don't contribute anything. The fact is, these stories connect each of us to the human race. And if, when we teach them to the next generation, folk, I think something is going to be lost that has connected us. I mean, you talk about Humpty Dumpty, when in my day, every young American boy and girl knew who we were talking about. And it might be based on a reality. I mean, I don't believe that there was somebody back there, way back, named Nimrod by name, who got really high and mighty and who had a great fall and was hacked to pieces by it, and his mother could not put him back together again. We didn't talk about that in this class, but Isis and Osiris, yes. Osiris was hacked to pieces, and Isis tried to put him back together again, and could not. But finally worked out a deal with the gods where he was exchanged. Half the time she spent in the upper world, and he was in another world, and the other half the time. What these myths mean, I'm not quite sure we know, but I don't think they were the mindset of a very primitive people. Now, I wanted to say this about intelligence. I didn't say this to the other class, but I do say this to my classes. I had a younger brother, well, I still have a younger brother, but he asked me more than 30 years ago, what if you marry someone and find out she was not as intelligent as you think she is? If anybody asks you that, what answer do you give? If you marry someone and find out that they're not very smart, I said, after you've talked to someone up to 5 minutes, you have a really good idea of what their intellectual level is. There's no place, there's no room to hide it. And the quality of the papers that some of you wrote, and I won't call names, I mean, of course, I haven't read most of yours, shows either an intellectual level or a strong lack thereof. All right, I'm going to give you an example. I got a C on a paper in high school. The paper was on welfare. Here's one sentence in that paper. I remember it for this day, and that's been 47 years ago. The world is made up of working men and not the man on relief. Here's what I should have put down. The purpose of welfare should be to help a person who has been temporarily set back get on his feet again and become a contributor, and not to create a class of dependents. I believe if I'd have put the latter, I'd have gotten a higher grade. Do you see the difference in the intellectual level? Yeah, the one is on an intellectual level down here. It's rhetoric. We talk about rhetoric before the class is over. The world is made up of the working man not the man on relief. I mean, hey, every one of us will probably at some time or point or another find ourselves needing welfare. If you want to use it to get yourself back on your feet after a temporary setback, fine. But if you want to become a dependent, and I don't think that I'm talking to anyone here, or you wouldn't be here in this classroom, to where society owes you a living, and not become a contributor, then that should not be what the government should allow for welfare. But anyway, you show your intelligence. By the way, you're right. And I want to say this about the ancient writings, particularly when I read about Socrates. You know, he wrote nothing but read Plato. That he was a man of extremely high intelligence who said some idiotic things, but nevertheless he was intelligent. And the same thing can be said about Aristotle. Just read his writings and you can see the intellectual depth come forth. And hear what they say that Socrates said, and he was a man of extremely high intelligence. It shows up, even though Socrates wrote nothing, it shows up in what the people tell us he said, the people around him. They were not of a primitive mentality. They were highly, highly advanced mentally. Perhaps in some ways more than we are. All right, I'll be quiet for a minute, and if any of you want to inject anything. Again, I've not read most of you, but the ones I have read from your class, most of you, you might say, like in football, you went for the fake. The quarterback faked here, and he went and tackled this man here, but the quarterback still had the ball, and he went and ran around him. All right, then I'll move on. All right, Athens. First person I want to talk about in the way of Athens is Solon, followed by Pisistratus, and then after him, Cleisthenes. Then we'll pause and interrupt our narrative about Athens to talk about the Peloponnesian Wars. The Persian Wars. There were two of them. All right. Now, Solon, in the case of Athens, folk, the Athenians began keeping their records, and from the time they started keeping their records, that's where we start their history, after a dark age. And in the course of their history, find that they were having a lot of problems. Wealthy aristocrats were struggling for power. Your common people were being swallowed up by the rich. And it just seemed like there was no justice. So, into this scenario, it is believed by many that Solon went to Egypt to get some advice on how to run a government. And he went to the Egyptian wise people and came back, in effect, with what amounted to a democracy, but not socialism. Anyway, Solon is remembered as being one of the wisest rulers that Athens ever had, or for that matter, one of the wisest that Greece ever had. Now, one of the problems they had was a lot of people would take out loans when they couldn't meet their obligations, and they would pledge themselves as collateral. Now, collateral, if you take out a car loan, you promise that if you can't pay that loan, the loan company will take it back. Or a home loan. If you can't make payment on your house, the loan company repossesses the house. Well, these people, though, would use themselves as collateral. If I can't pay this loan back, I will become your slave. Far too many people were becoming slaves. Well, Solon outlawed the use of humans as collateral. In other words, not only would people pledge themselves as collateral, sometimes they'd pledge their son or their daughter or someone, maybe their wife as collateral or themselves. Solon said we are not going to have any more loans where that person pledged themselves as collateral. And all persons who have pledged themselves as collateral, they're still obligated to pay their loan back. Now, what a lot of the poor people wanted from Solon was for a cancellation of debts. In the Near East, many a ruler, as soon as he took over, one of the first things he'd do to make himself popular was to cancel all debts. Personally, I believe this is immoral. and not necessarily wise, but they would do this, cancel all that. This meant that all of a sudden all the money that was owed to you would no longer be owed. That may not sound so great, but then all the money you owed to somebody else would be canceled also. You might think that was great. Most people would just promptly go be back deeper into debt again and find themselves deeper into obligation. But humans now, but one thing Solon did not do, again, because I think he may have learned this bit of wisdom from the Egyptians, he did not redistribute land or redistribute wealth. He did not. Now, eventually somebody asked me that same question this morning. You mean, did I say he did not? Yeah, I said he did not. Now, again, folk, there was a problem they had that a lot of the land was being taken up by a few rich, and the rich were getting richer and the poor getting poorer. Solon did not take the extra land from the rich like the poor wanted him to redistribute the land. This has been done by many a ruler from that time forward. It had been done before. I challenge anyone to find any instance where it actually worked and created peace and harmony and equality. Folk, the rich are snakes. Let me tell you. But I attended a snake show one time, and this man showed off his snake. He said, "Now at home I have a pet snake. I also have a dog." So now, as much as we hate snakes, one of these days we're going to kill them off. I mean, as soon as we see one, the first thing we're going to do is kill it. We'll run over them with automobiles, and they have no defense against our cars. He said, but once they're gone, we're going to miss them. When they're all gone, we're going to wish they were back. We don't realize how much good they're doing us. Same with the rich. Get rid of the rich, and all of a sudden, every one of us become poor. The richer the rich get, the richer I get. Let them get rich. Folks, there's a certain kind of crab in South America. If you put one of them in a bushel basket, he'll crawl out. But the natives put a dozen or more of them in a bushel basket and never put a lid on. None of them ever crawl out. When one starts to get a little bit higher, the rest of them will pull him back down. There's a moral lesson in that. All right, anyway, Solon, he did not solve all the problems. The people became discontent. And finally, he got tired of the discontent and retired. But after he was gone, the people of Athens elevated him like similar to what has happened to a lot of people, including Abraham Lincoln, own president, who was called an idiot or an imbecile while he was alive. Then once he died, they couldn't elevate him high enough, and they put him on a pedestal equal to George Washington. And he is still there on that pedestal. Solon, the Greeks, the Athenians put him on a pedestal. But Solon lived long enough to see what he didn't want. Pisistratus took over. Pisistratus was a tyrant. Again, that's not necessarily mean he was bad. Of all the tyrants, Pisistratus was a pretty good one. One of the last of the Greek tyrants. The Greeks eventually got rid of their tyranny and went for democracy. Oh yes, something else I must say about Solon. He was a reformer. Now, the concept of reform, to me, seems to be unique only to Europeans. You go to other parts of the world and you don't see reform even when they need it. Europe even went through a period of time in the early 1500s called the Reformation. And I talked to a man at Lockheed one time where he said, well, where we come from, we never had a Reformation. I felt like saying to him, no, but you needed one. Everybody needs a Reformation. I have attended a few high school and college reunions, and there's one award that they give away that I have never received, and an award that I do not want. And that's the award for who is the least changed. If I have not changed from my high school days, then I'm a complete total fraud. Actually, my wife got that award when she went back to reunion. I have never received it, and I don't want it. All right. Anyway, reform. Now, among Europeans, folk, I challenge any of you to find a case where Europeans had an abuse that was not followed by a call for reform. What about the abuse where they took millions of people out of and enslaved them? Were there calls for reform? What about where the United States had slaves? Were there calls for reform? among Europeans and European offshoots like North and South America, every time there's an abuse, there are calls for reform. In other parts of the world, they'll have abuses with nobody calling for reform until the outsiders, until Europeans come in and say, hey, what you're doing is wrong. A classic example, I don't know, but there's several examples where other kind of places in the world, not Europeans, would allow certain abuses to go on for generation after generation, even for millennia. And nobody questioned it. The Europeans said, hey, this is wrong. And eventually got some things changed. But Europeans have had a knack for reform from her beginning. Solon was a reformer. Pisistratus, a tyrant. The last of them, but he was a pretty good one. Then moving on, whoops, I didn't mean to erase that, but I'll get it. Cleisthenes. Now, he made some reforms also. One thing, he organized the 10 tribes. Here's why. The people of Athens were following tribal law, and the tribes, of course, are based on your ancestry. So in order to a person would claim, I'm descended from this person, I can prove it because I've got records for so-and-so, then he was of that tribe. And another person, well, what happened? Some tribes became much bigger than others, and then some tribes started to control the politics. Cleisthenes said, I'll tell you what, we're going to abolish the old tribal loyalties. Instead, I'm going to make every one of you members of just 10 tribes, and you'll be put in this tribe by lottery, not by family. So he would roll a dice, and say, okay, you got, the dice came up number 6, you go there with the number 6, you join number 6 tribe, and you join number 7 tribe. And eventually he had 10 equal tribes chosen by lottery. Then he also appointed the council of 500. Again, these were men. Now, I must say this, folks. Except for Plato, most of the Greeks believed that women had no part in government. Plato was an exception. There might have been a few others. But these were men who were picked, again, by lottery to sit on a council, and they made Athens' decision. Now, I'm going to jump ahead of the story, but the Council of 500 wound up getting a bad name for itself when it condemned Socrates to death. But the Council of 500 was to run Greek politics from the time of Cleisthenes until finally the Romans took over, years later, about 300 or 400 years later. So the Council of 500 was to be in charge of Athenian politics. And it was to help guarantee that Athens would remain a democracy. Essentially, Cleisthenes is credited with making Athens even more democratic. Making their tribal loyalties even, setting up a council and appointing the council by lottery rather than popular vote. Again, today the question is, why not by popular vote? All right. Now, we're going to, like the book does, we're going to interrupt our narrative about the politics of Greece. Well, I must mention, I'm looking at page 101. The one thing I want to mention about the influence on early Greek culture, the Greeks began to settle and fan out and settle here in Asia Minor. What is today Turkey? But Turkey did not get called Turkey till the 1300s. But they began to fan out here, and this is going to become important. It explains why they wound up going to war with Persia. But also, in the case of their alphabet, they took 22 consonants from the Phoenician alphabet, and then they added some vowels. And it's hard to believe that the Phoenicians did not have vowel sounds in their alphabet, but they didn't. Now, the alphabet that we're using today is almost like the Greeks, except we wound up adopting the Latin alphabet, which it has different symbols, but the Latin alphabet also has consonants and vowels. Hopefully all of you know what a consonant is, and your vowels, A, E, I, O, U, sometimes W, and sometimes Y. Not very often, but on occasion, W and Y. All right. Anyway, they set up an alphabet copy of the Phoenicians, except they improved it over the Phoenician alphabet. Then, turning a page, we come to the Persians. All right, there were two Persian wars. The first one was led by Darius, king of Persia. The second one led by the Persian king Xerxes. Essentially, what was going on was that Persia had conquered this territory here. I mean, it was about 3,000, almost as large as the United States, from northwest India, what's today Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iran, Iraq, Egypt, and Asia Minor. You know, they had all this empire, but a lot of Greeks were living here in Asia Minor, and the Greek people were encouraging their Greek relatives to rebel. The king, Darius, decided he needed to do something about this, so he sent his army over to conquer the Greeks. To make a long story short, I think all of you know or should know, they failed to do so. However, the one battle I want you to remember in the case of Darius is the Battle of the Marathon. Now, the Greeks, we'll talk about it later, they had, every 4 years, they had a series of contests called Olympic Games. And during the games, they would quit their wars, and they would give a olive leaf to the person who won. Well, in this case, a man had won him. The last Olympic had won him named Thucydides. And Thucydides had won because he was the fastest runner in all of Greece. Well, when Darius arrived with his army, because Thucydides was a champion, he was sent to run 150 miles to warn all the Greek city-states that the Persians are here. Reminds me of Paul Revere, except Paul Revere rode a horse. The Thucydides ran on foot to tell them that the Persians were here. Now, you might think they could have let him get off, but no, they made him fight the Battle of Marathon. So after running 150 miles, he was quite tired, but he fought the Battle of Marathon, which his side won. Then they sent him to run the 26 miles from Marathon to Athens to tell the Athenians that we'd won, that the Greeks had won. He ran the 26 miles and got to the city square, and he was exhausted, and he was able to get out of his mouth, "Victory is ours," and fell down dead. To commemorate that event, from that day till this, runners have run the marathon. We still run it in our Olympics today, and it's 26 miles long. Most of you might have heard of it. It's in memory of Thucydides, who literally ran his heart out to warn the Greeks that the Persians were near to fight the battle, and then tell the fellow Athenians that we've won the battle. Anyway, Marathon, Darius went home in defeat. Darius died, his son Xerxes took over. Now, Xerxes initially engaged the Greeks at a pass called Thermopylae. Let's see. Basically, Thermopylae was a narrow pass that had some high walls, and you could not do any flanking maneuvers. Supposedly, anyway, you couldn't. Well, 300 Spartans met the Persians at the pass, led by the King Leonidas of Sparta, and these Spartans stood shoulder to shoulder. Now, there was a movie made about this. Did you ever happen to see it? 300 Spartans, called the 300, one of you had, and the other crowd, about 2 or 3 I at least saw it. I was tempted to buy it once, and then when I went back to Walmart, it was gone. I could order it on eBay, I guess, but I just never have bothered. Anyway, the story was that the Persian king told the Spartan king, "We're going to shoot so many arrows at you, you won't even be able to see the sun." And the Persian king said, "Wonderful, we'll fight you in the shade." Anyway, the 300 men stood shoulder to shoulder, and the Persians could not overtake them. But then there was a traitor among the Greeks. The traitor is a person who should be on your side. He was born into your camp, but actually he winds up on the other side. This traitor showed the Persians a way to get around the pass, and the 300 Spartans then were surrounded in front and behind. And if you know anything about that kind of fighting, once the enemy got around your flank or around behind you, they would whip you. The 300 Persians stood to the ground and fought to the last man and died. That wasn't the last of it. The Greeks realized that, hey, we probably have a better navy than they do. The Greeks had, better sailors, were excellent sailors. So the Greeks met them near Athens, at a place called Salamis. Now, folks, there's a story going around that a Greek philosopher had a big magnifying lens, except it was a concave mirror, and he focused the sunlight onto Persian ships. So he'd catch the Persian ships on fire. Now, maybe many of you as kids would play with magnifying glasses where you try to light up a dry leaf or a piece of paper and focus the sun's light on a small area and set up a piece of paper on fire. Okay, so supposedly this Greek philosopher was able to set a bunch of Persian ships on fire. The problem is our modern scientists have tried this today with many different types of concave lenses and many different types of boats, wooden boats. We haven't set anything on fire. Nevertheless, this story comes down to us. Again, I don't know what to believe. I have my suspicions that the ancients were right. And that why can't we do it today? May have something to do with this moisture level, the atmosphere.
But who knows what they were building boats with? You know what I mean? I feel like so many
What's that?
things. I feel like so many things could have changed.
That's right. No, they might have had a different type of wood, maybe even a drier. One thing we know about the Chinese, when they built their large vessels, they would take the wood, teak, and bury it in the ground. I don't know how deep. Bury it for several years. Then when they pull this, they'd cover it over so it wouldn't rot. Bury it for several years. When they pull this teak up out of the ground, it would be really, really hard wood.
Like petrified.
Oh, if something like that. Yeah, not petrified rock, but it would be really hard. And they could build a stronger ship than they could have built had they not hardened it. Again, these people might have used much older wood for their boats. We don't know. Older wood than ours, and the wood that would be easier set on fire. Again, we have not, from what I've heard, we have not been able to do it. Anyway, whatever, the Battle of Salamis was a big victory for the Greeks and a defeat for Xerxes. In fact, Xerxes got arrogant and said, build me a throne that I can watch my people defeat the Greeks. And they built him a wooden throne, and he sat there and watched the Greeks defeat his navy. Xerxes, to make a long story short, wound up going home in defeat also. Actually, the last battle was the Battle of Plataea. I'm not going to write that down, but it's just northwest of Attica, where Athens is located. The Greeks won the war, and now they were freed up because it was to be, well, actually, the Persians were never to return. Instead, the Greeks were destined later to go and defeat and conquer the Persians, but that was to come later. All right. Now we go back to the history of Athens, the political history. After Cleisthenes, you get to one of the greatest statesmen of all time, Pericles. Pericles goes down as one of the greatest statesmen Athens ever had. He was elected by popular vote to be Athens' leader. They had elections every year. He was elected 29 out of 30 years, and the one year he wasn't, it was a close race. Any politician might fall temporarily out of favor. Now, under him, the Greeks formed two leagues. The Delian League, led by Athens, and the Peloponnesian League, led by Sparta. Both leagues were formed supposedly to ward off a future Persian attack, which they believed was going to come. It never did. Now, I can't explain why, folks. If the Persians had been wise, they would have attacked right while these two sides were at war with each other, but they didn't. Anyway, now, in the case of the Peloponnesian League, they didn't issue heavy taxes. They were led by Sparta, and Sparta did not believe in wealth and luxury. But in the case of the Delian League, they told the people of Athens, said, you pay taxes to us, and in turn, we will protect you if Persia ever attacks. Well, then Athens collected all this tax money from all these other cities, and used the money to beautify itself. They built the Parthenon, the Acropolis, Mars Hill, and a whole lot of temples, and just a whole lot of paved streets. Hardly ever was a city able to beautify itself so inexpensively and so easily. And some of their structures stand today, particularly the Parthenon. Now, unfortunately, the Parthenon, they used as a gunpowder storage during one of the wars in the 1600s, and the gunpowder blew up and greatly damaged the Parthenon, and it was never repaired. Now, folks, I've seen a lot of 1930s, 40s, and 50s cars restored, but restoring an old stone structure, it really can't be done. The only thing you do is just simply take away the old stone. But what happens is these stones, the temperature, all of you hopefully know that when the temperature rises, the stones expand. When the temperature contracts, the stones shrink. And after a while, the stones will start to chip. Eventually, they'll crumble, and they'll crumble some more. And if a little bit of water gets inside between the crack in the stones, then the water freezes. It will make the crack wider. I mean, I see this in my house with the wood in my house, particularly on the outside railing. The wood starts to crack, water gets in, the water freezes and expands the crack wider and wider. If you haven't seen this yet, you will. Of course, today a lot of our railing is made of, not of wood, but of vinyl, which might be better than wood. I don't know. I'm thinking the next railing I get might be vinyl. But anyway, leaving that, the stone structures in Athens and in Rome that came later simply have not survived, folk. And they have not been restored or rebuilt either. Can take a building like this one. We built it in such a way that the ceiling is easy to fix. When the ceiling gets old and crumbles, we can just simply put another one up. The walls, every once in a while, we go through and paint them. When the walls crack, and even when these walls here crack, we could just simply go and repair it. I mean, easy to do. And when a building just gets too old, it's easy to disassemble, get a few bulldozers and a few right kind of crew, and they can take this old building away and put a new one right in its place fairly easily. It was not the same in those days. So those buildings, they built these nice, beautiful stone cities. They'd last a few generations, then they'd crumble and crack, and there was no easy, practical way to repair them without taking away all the stones and putting new, starting from scratch. Anyway, his period is called the Age of Pericles. Your book goes into some detail about how he managed the city, but this was the classical age of Greece. Then, inevitably, the decline set in. For one thing, some of the Delian cities said, hey, there's no more threat from Persia, we're going to pull out. Athens said, no, once you're in this league, you stay in. But they were unwilling partners. In the meantime, the Peloponnesian partners, who were not taxed so heavily, they stayed together. The Delian partners did not cleave together very well, and this was to be the undoing of democracy. Folk, this reminds me so much of the Cold War I grew up with the Peloponnesian League led by Sparta being the Soviet Union and its satellite states, and the Delian League led by Athens being the United States and its allies. The sad part of it is I think I've already told you in the history books, initially, Sparta won. Now I say initially. Today, Sparta is nothing but a heap of stones, and Athens has 2 million people living in it. In the long run, Athens won, but in the short run, Athens fared terribly. Now, there was a story. This story is not in the book, but at one time, the people of Athens decided we're going to build walls. Sparta said, oh no, this will make you too powerful. They were trying to maintain a balance of power. And balance of power, folks, is what's been a part of European politics for a few hundred years. In fact, balance of power kept Europe at peace for 100 years, from 1815 to 1914. Eventually, the balance was broken and World War I broke out. But anyway, Pericles said, perhaps you're right. I tell you what, now I'll come and talk to you about it. So Pericles prepared to go to talk to the Spartans about whether or not they should build the walls. But then, before that, Pericles whispered to his top aide, I want you to build these walls 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Build them day and night. When you get the walls finished, come and send for me. So Pericles took his time about getting to Sparta. When there, he treated the Spartans with a lot of courtesy and respect, pretending to halfway agree with them. Now, but maybe we could work some deal out. Let's see what we can work out. Then one day, one of his aides came from Athens and said, "Sir, the walls are finished." Pericles said, "Bye-bye to the Spartans," and went home. Tricked the Spartans, but it was a short-lived victory for him. The Spartans came to discuss their side of the peace, and Athens would not agree. So the Spartans shook their fists at the Athenians. They led and said, "This is going to go down in history as a terrible day for the Athenians." They spoke very truly. The Peloponnesian War was to last 20 years. Now, the first year did not go so badly for Athens. Athens relied on its navy, of which Sparta had none. But Sparta they had a really strong, well-trained group of soldiers. But Athens had found that its men could fight even against the Spartans. At the end of the first year, Pericles gave his funeral oration. These people would fight in the summertime, and then in the fall go home and rest and regroup, and go back out in the spring and resume the fighting again, much like our baseball teams, playing an outdoor game only in the summertime. But anyway, during the fall, when the war was over, at least part of when there was a temporary truce, they had a funeral service for the fallen heroes of Athens, and Pericles gave his funeral oration, of which you'll see some of at the beginning of the chapter. Then came the second year of the war. Sparta went to Athens and encamped around the city and laid siege to it. Now, keep in mind that 90% of the Athenian people lived outside the walls. They were farmers. It took at least 9 farmers to supply one person living inside the city. Well, that meant that Athens was a really, really crowded city with everybody living inside the walls, and the Spartans knew they might soon starve to death. Instead, they had a better stroke of luck than that. A plague broke out among the Athenians, which did not affect the Spartans. The Spartans were not intermingling with the Athenians at this time, but a plague broke out, and it began to carry off the Athenian population. It wound up carrying off Pericles himself. But the plague was disastrous, and it forced Athens to eventually ask for terms temporarily. Then Athens resumed the fight, and all told, Athens was to keep losing one after another. But anyway, during the plague, when people were dying, I'm going to give you a little aside here. This is something that's on a personal note, personal to Pericles, that is. Pericles did not believe that a man should cry. He believed that crying was for women only. We had a general in World War II named Patton who did not believe that men should cry. And let me hasten to say, I do not in any way subscribe to this view. They asked Norman Schwarzkopf, General Sloan Norman, if soldiers could cry. He said, yes, soldiers do cry. Robert E. Lee did. He named several of them who did. Anyway, Pericles did not believe that a person could cry. Also, Pericles had 2 legitimate sons, that is, sons that came from a lawful union between him and his wife. But earlier in his life, he had had an illegitimate son with a town girl who he acknowledged was his son, but he was illegitimate. Now, the Greeks had a law that illegitimate sons did not inherit any part of the estate. Only legitimate sons could inherit. Well, and when the plague came, a lot of fathers found themselves losing their sons, their legitimate son. They would go to the Council of 500 and ask the council to change a law allowing illegitimate sons to inherit. Pericles himself said no. The council would always say no, illegitimate sons do not inherit. Well, Pericles' first son died. Pericles maintained what you call a stiff upper lip, buried his first son. Shortly afterward, his second son died. But as he was burying his second son, all of a sudden Pericles' emotions got completely out of control, and said he just broke down and sobbed uncontrollably. And maybe the best thing that happened to him emotionally. But again, keep in mind, this was a man who didn't believe in that kind of display of emotion. But then he himself went to the same assembly and begged, will you please let my illegitimate son inherit my estate? The same assembly that he had always opposed. It was the same law he'd always opposed. Now he wanted a law in his favor. The assembly of the Council of 500 said no. Shortly afterwards, Pericles himself caught the plague and he died, and I don't know where his estate went. Anyway, that's just a little story I thought I'd throw in to give you some idea how these people lived, what their thoughts were. A little aside, you might say. Anyway, the Greeks, the Athenians were to suffer terribly at the hands of the Spartans. And eventually Sparta was to go in, burn up all of the ships of Athens' navy, completely order the navy disbanded, tore down the city walls and burnt the city and said, in effect, you can start all over, but you're not to have any kind of armaments. You are to remain disarmed. Then the Spartans turned around later and rearmed the Athenians because the Helots, the Spartan slaves, revolted, and they, of all things, Sparta called on Athens to help put down the slave rebellion, and Sparta and Athens got together and put down the slave rebellion. This was, these people would switch loyalties and switch sides really fast. Anyway, the Peloponnesian War ended in a big defeat for Athens. Now, we're going to digress here. We'll come back to politics and start talking about Greek culture. In the writing of history, the one name I want you to remember is Herodotus. He is called the father of history because he was the first person we know of. I think the Jews were, but he was to write a history of the world from the beginning of the world and write it as best as he understood it with all the information he had, telling how the world began. And he wrote a detailed account of Persia, and most of what we know about the Persian Empire comes from him. He wrote a lot of the history of Greece. Now, unfortunately, he threw in a lot of history that we would today call mythologies. And again, folks, that's what the topic's about. And even though actually he left out a lot of mythology, but he threw in some mythology, or quite a bit. It was up to the next one after him, Thucydides, whose name I will not write down. But Thucydides wrote, and he left out more mythology by far than Herodotus did. Your book calls it divine history. Herodotus wrote in a lot of divine history. Thucydides left a lot of it out. But these two men began to make a study of history as had not been done by any other people before them. Now, Greek drama. So much of Greek drama involved tragedies. Now, a tragedy is defined in literature as a story where the protagonist dies. Now, I used a big word there, protagonist. How many of you have run into this word in your English classes? Okay, several hands. In my other class, almost every hand went up. The protagonist is the main character of the story, the hero of the story. I used to watch the Westerns and wonder why the heroes of the story never got killed, never got shot, and hardly ever got wounded. Always came out on top, always were right. Well, in the Greek stories, the tragedies, the main character did in fact die, and often it was because the gods had willed it. In other words, fatalism. Now, the Chinese had a belief in fatalism. Fatalism is a belief that what will be will be. It's determined in advance, and there is nothing we do to prevent it. Now, one story that I already told you about fatalistic is the story of Achilles, who the gods foretold he was going to die in battle, and his mother did everything she could to prevent it, but Achilles grew up and eventually died in battle, and no way to prevent it. The famous story of Oedipus Rex. There's Oedipus who is told that he was going to kill his father, marry his mother. So his father, to prevent this, sent him away and thought he'd gotten rid of the boy. But instead, young Oedipus grew up and eventually, without knowing that the king was his father, killed his father and married his mother, the queen, without knowing that she was his mother. Again, because the gods had decreed, the gods had willed it. And this leads to the phenomenon in psychology known as an Oedipus complex. Sigmund Freud coined the term, and supposedly because he himself had an Oedipus complex. I don't want to elaborate on that any further. Anyway, Greek drama, they would put on plays, and as far as we know, they were just like the first people to do so. And eventually, a European named Shakespeare was to put on some of their plays or to also put on other, he was to copy their ideas. A lot of these plays were put on in amphitheaters where they would get themselves down like in a pit, surrounded by a bunch of stones, and the theater itself would serve as an echo. That meant that their voice would carry even without public address system to where they could have an audience of up to 5,000 to 10,000 people, and the actors' voices would carry, and yes, I did say actor, not actress. Again, it's the times. But the actors' voices would carry all the way across the entire amphitheater. So they built theaters, they put on plays. Those two plays are the ones I've mentioned. I believe I might ought to write those. Well, hang on. I'll write this down. I'm not sure if that's going to be on the test or not, but just in case. At least some of you are familiar with that name already. You've run into the name Oedipus in your psychology classes or your literature classes, I suppose. All right. Now, the arts. Today is my second daughter's birthday, and she's majoring in art at UGA. I don't often have much to say about art. When it comes to Greek, I do want to elaborate on their art. Greek art strove for something today's artists do not, realism. Now, ever since the invention of the camera, our artists have the idea of leave realism to the camera. And your painting is what's called sometimes a surreal world or even an unreal world. A world that's slightly removed from reality, where that certain colors are slightly unreal or exaggerated. But the Greeks strove for realism, and they would brag that they could make a statue of an apple that was so real that the deer would come up and lick it. Or statues of acorns that were so real that the squirrels would come up and try to eat them, made out of stone. They strove for realism and also strove for idealism, particularly the ideal human body. They enjoyed making statues of their gods because their gods had the ideal human body. Now, when I was 11 years old, a neighbor boy asked me, why do the statues of Greek gods always show them naked? I didn't know how to answer that at the time, but today, the best answer I can give is the Greeks believed that their gods had the ideal body, and they wanted to set forth the ideal body. The ideal body was a broad-shouldered, muscular man with muscles all over his arm and muscle all over his. Reminds you a lot of the Superman books, where the Superman had the ideal body, as did Batman, as did Captain America. Now, I had a student ask me, and I have to say, who's to say what the ideal body is? But anyway, now where this was to come back to haunt us was in the 20th century, when Adolf Hitler believed that he wanted to create a race of people where all the men had these ideal bodies like a Greek god, which is just an impossibility to achieve. But many years ago, there was a man named Charles Atlas who had advertised in comment. He would claim that he could take any boy from 14 to 60, or any man 14 to 60, and build up an ideal body, make you like him. He said, I did it. And the ad would show someone come up in his face and kicking sand in his face on a beach, and he was too skinny to do anything about it. You've probably seen the ads. Now, the ads would feature a before. A model was before. And before, this was either some skinny person or some overweight fat person. And then there was after. The after was on. And I would take a magnifying glass to try to see if the before model was the same, but you could not tell. And I have heard since that they would use different models for the before and the after. So really the whole thing was a fake. But Charles Atlas claimed he could give you the ideal body, but we have since learned that unless you have the right genetic combination, folks, you simply cannot build a body like the body of a Greek god, like the body of Superman. Anyway, in the case of Hitler, he was determined that anyone who was not of the master race was going to be exterminated. And this is what the sad part of it. The Superman books, by the way, I hate to say, because I was a reader of Superman when I was a kid, and still watching movies growing up. Superman came from a German man named Nietzsche who wanted to create a race of Supermen himself, which Hitler followed. And Superman might have been an attempt by the Nazis to infiltrate American thinking. I do have a book at home written in the 1930s. It was my graduate school textbook for medieval history. And my professor, Dr. Harold Fink by name, he's now deceased, but he was an old professor in 1971 using a 1930s textbook, which today would be considered that. But this textbook told about how wonderful the German race was and how that the German race had come down and infused new blood into the Roman race. Basically was proclaiming German superiority on this side of the Atlantic, folk, in the 1930s. I can actually show you several lines in the book to that effect. Anyway, I've digressed far because this idea of the ideal body has come to haunt us several times throughout history. And it did in the case of the Greeks. Again, it's a total impossibility to achieve. And also they had the ideal female body. The goddesses had the ideal female body, and again, folk, that total impossibility to achieve a race where everybody has the same kind of body, men and women. And again, who's to say what the ideal body is? But the Greeks thought that they knew. In today's advertisements, the women are said to be computer enhanced. But the Greek statues of their goddesses were probably not real also, just as fake. All right. Now, this takes us up to philosophy. Greek love of wisdom. It actually starts off with a Greek mathematician. Now, you might think Pythagoras was not a philosopher. Wrong. They all were. He's remembered for the Pythagorean theorem. All right. Oops, I drew it wrong. Then the Pythagorean theorem, a squared plus b squared equals c squared. Hopefully all of you have seen this before. I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, but hopefully you've seen this. All right, in the case of this triangle, if this side is 3, never mind what is 3 feet, 3 inches, 3 yards, right, and this side is 4, what will this hypotenuse be? Assuming this is a right angle. I heard somebody say it. This side will be 5. 3 squared is 9. 4 squared is 16. 9 plus 16 equals 25, which is a perfect square. Now, again, I hope I didn't move too fast for you. Hopefully all of you have seen this before. This is called the Pythagorean theorem. A squared plus b squared equals c squared. Very important in mathematics, very important in building and construction. Used in this building because in this building, if you take the ceiling, if you find a bunch of triangles, which is one of the strongest shapes you can have for a ceiling, a flat ceiling, triangular in shape. Again, if you look up sometime, you can see what I mean. All right. Now, it is said that Pythagoras went to Egypt and got his theorem from Egyptian scholars, just like Plato is said to have done something similar. Now, moving from Pythagoras, there are the sophists. The sophist now, I'm going to jump ahead again. Albert Einstein believed that he could explain every phenomenon in the universe. He called it the unified field theory. Today, some scientists call this the TOE, T-O-E, or the theory of everything. That one of these days, we're going to come up with a scientific theory that will explain every phenomena in the universe. I have read some modern-day scientists are saying that, heck, folk, there are some things that just simply are not going to be explained. Be that as it may, I'm not going to say, because I don't know what we're going to explain, what we don't, but we'll say this about all of the theories that we have. Now, okay, there's 2 types of science. There's the practical and there's the theoretical. The practical, that's where we make better computers. I mean, you figure out you can put this resistor, exchange this resistor for this one, and the amplifier you have will sound better. That's practical science. But theoretical science is, well, the universe began with a Big Bang, which cannot be proven. On the area of theoretical science, folks, there's not one theory that we have that doesn't have some serious flaw and some reason, compelling reason why it simply cannot be true. I hope all of you heard this from somewhere or another before. The sophists now, they said the universe can never be explained and we shouldn't even try. Now, at this point, I don't agree with them. I think it's okay to try, but I suspect that they were right in one thing. The universe might be beyond human comprehension. But anyway, they said the universe can't be explained, so instead what our duty is to make the best of our lives that we can without worrying about how the universe came together and how it's going to end, where we came from or where we're going. They also were much into rhetoric. Now, I want to elaborate on the rhetoric a bit. In our own history, American history, there were two men who lived in the same state. One of them named Thomas Jefferson, the other named Patrick Henry. They lived the same. The two men knew each other. They even liked each other. They were friends. But they were different light and dark. Now, the one man, in describing the King of England, he said, he has often dissolved our legislative bodies. He has dissolved our judges. He has appointed governors over us without our consent. He has imposed taxes on us without our consent. He has taken our men to England for trial without our consent, and where they cannot get witnesses to rely on their character. He has tried us without the benefit of a jury trial without our consent. That's Thomas Jefferson. Notice, now, here's Patrick Henry. Our chains are already forged. You can hear their clanking on the plains of Boston. Is life so dear and peace so sweet to be purchased with the price of chains and of slavery? I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death. Which one of those two men were into rhetoric? Anyone of you know? Who? Patrick Henry, rhetoric. Thomas Jefferson, substance. Patrick Henry. Now, rhetoric is often used in democracy in order to persuade the assembly or the governing body to get up and give an emotional speech, a soul-stirring speech. Give me liberty or give me death. Our chains have been already forged. You can hear their clanking if you go to Boston. A little bit of exaggeration. But again, this is what they used to persuade the legislative assemblies to vote their way. A lot of rhetoric. Speech making. The Greeks were greatly into speech making. A sophist. Rhetoricians. Rhetoric, emotion, not necessarily substance. Now, this takes us up, folk, to the most famous philosopher of all time, Socrates. And I know I'm running out of time. Socrates is famous for a couple of sayings, one of them being, know thyself. Some have said that no, this saying was not original with him. This saying actually was somebody else. But know thyself. Also, the unexamined life is not worth living. He believed that if we would just examine ourselves, we would not do a lot of the wrong that we do. Just simply say, is this right? And with self-examination, each of you can decide for yourself whether you think that this was great or not. Now, there's an overview. I want to start by saying Socrates taught Plato, and Plato taught Aristotle. Aristotle was destined to teach Alexander the Great. Now, Alexander was no philosopher, but Alexander conquered most of the known world, and by this way, the teachings of these three men was spread over the entire Greek world, which they called the Hellenistic world at the time. Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Now, folk, I'm going to insert one of my own opinions. I mean, hey, I've spent a lot of time studying these men. In a lot of ways, I admire them. Yes, they were highly intelligent. But as is the case of all intelligent people, the higher up they get in one area of intelligence, the less intelligent they are in another area. And they were capable of uttering some statements that are just simply irrationally foolish. And I don't like saying this about them because I do admire them, for at least they got an audience, people who listen to them. But everything they touched, they ruined. First of all, they ruined the city of Athens without them meaning to. Then they ruined the Greek civilization, again, perhaps without them meaning to. Then they ruined the Hellenistic civilization when Alexander spread their philosophy all over the world. And then they wound up, I believe, contributing more than their fair share in destroying the Roman Empire. There are several things wrong with him, which I won't get around to talking about in this class. But anyway, we're going back to Socrates to give you some idea. I mean, he was highly, highly influential. His method, question and answer. He believed that the answer to everything lies somewhere inside of us. And a lot of New Age philosophers, by the way, believe the same thing. And all it's going to take is somebody asking you enough questions long enough, and eventually it will come out. Now, folks, I'm going to ask you a question that's really important, but probably none of you know the answer. How tightly should the nuts on your cylinder head of your car be torqued? None of you know? I don't know either. Somebody has to know that. Now, I'll say this. Anybody who wants to can keep asking you that same question over and over again. If you don't know the answer, it won't come out. I mean, hey, everybody still believe in a question and answer. I mean, that's how the test questions designed to help you learn. Testing is part of the learning process. Questioning is part of the learning process. But if you don't know it, and also the questions you miss are the questions you most likely to remember down through the years. And there were questions I missed in high school and in college and even in graduate school. I still remember. The ones you missed are the ones you most likely to remember. Hey, question and answer is great in as far as it goes. About the cylinder head on your car, if one nut is torqued tighter than another, the pounding of the pistons on that head is going to loosen that nut and loosen that shaft and eventually tear your whole engine apart. So that's how important it is. All the nuts have to be torqued to the same tightness. And the engineers have decided in advance of what is the correct tightness. In other words, somebody has to know. You don't have to, perhaps, but somebody does. Anyway, now, I'm desperately out of time. Socrates would find people on their way to court and question them, and he got the people mad because he would convince them that they had the worst case. Now, folks, everybody who goes to court believes he has the better case. But you get before a judge, and oftentimes the judge will rule against you. And I've seen people leave the courtroom in tears, thinking for sure this would be an easy case, and the judge would see things, or the jury would see things differently. Socrates would try to convince you the other man's case is better, and of course he made a lot of people angry at him. All right, now there's a lot more I'm going to say about Socrates. I'm going to have to take up for that next time. If the weather permits, I hope to see you all on Wednesday. Everybody have a good couple of days, and I'm going to have some really hair-raising, shocking things to say about Socrates, I guarantee. So hopefully you'll be here.